get the largest viewing of all of the graphics that we will be showing you here a little bit later this evening. We are scheduled for 2 hours, so we are going to be monitoring the time as we go to make sure that we are staying on schedule to respect each of your time. Before we get started, I would like to pose a few questions of you just to understand our audience a little bit better. We had quite a large number, over 100 folks that registered to participate this evening. And so we would like to ask a few questions, 5 questions in fact, for each of you to answer. So Brian, if you can bring those up for me, please. There we are. And if each of you would take the next 10, 15, 20 seconds to respond to each of those questions, the poll will then close and we will be able to show the results. So we're all able to see kind of our demographics, if you will. So please begin now. In the meantime, I will introduce Kathleen. Kathleen Osher is overseeing this project from the city side, working directly with Mark and everybody else in the, throughout the city. Kathleen has been extensively involved through the earlier phases of this project and has been very much a leader for us in this process. So Kathleen, would you like to give your opening comments, and then I will cover the poll results.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Brett, and thanks to everyone that's joining us this evening. I just want to echo Mark Ralph's comments. It is, there's a lot of uncertainties right now, so we appreciate everyone's ability to tune in with us this evening and keep what is arguably one of the top priorities for the city moving along. Obviously, this studio was designed to be something very different. This process that we've customized to walk through creating a unified land use code looks a little different in the face of the uncertainties with the coronavirus. And so we appreciate that you're here tonight for this virtual studio. There's a lot of ground that we hope to cover tonight. I'm just going to remind everyone again, if you'd please put your phones and microphones on mute. Turn your videos off, then I think that that'll allow everyone to focus and participate throughout the evening. Obviously, tonight is really designed to help us together as a community and the city, as well as the consultant team, to really understand how we see this idea of community character that we've been talking about over the last couple of years, how it really comes to life in downtown and what the future of downtown looks like with that. Obviously, we've gone into this process knowing and understanding that we see it as a true process of discovery. So we have customized this so that we can have as many community conversations, input, things like this virtual studio, so that we can understand how to deliver on the vision of the community as well as the comprehensive plan. We're not envisioning this as part of a process for drastic rezoning. In many cases, zoning stays the same. But what we do want to do is really deliver on those next pieces. I think we can go to the next slide, Brett, and then we can come back into why we're really thinking this unified land use code will work so well for us. So the point of this evening is we want to get you involved as early in the process as possible. Obviously, we were planning to be at the Elks Lodge all together, and up until about a week ago, we thought maybe there's a possibility we can still do that. And we had 80 people in the community that were ready to join us. Our numbers did increase a little bit coming into this virtual studio, so we're super excited by how many people were able to make the time to be with us tonight. We hope that an opportunity to kind of exchange ideas and preferences and really solicit some input and consensus, and go through what we think are going to be some visuals and different ideas, and you'll be able to kind of guide us on what you think is possible and not. The Unified Land Use Code for us is really the opportunity to connect our regulations to the 2040 vision that we adopted in 2018. This is obviously, as I mentioned before, a top priority for the city. One of the number one priorities identified in the comprehensive plan. We see this as an opportunity to kind of streamline the regulations, make them predictable, make them clear. But we also think it's a great opportunity to kind of simplify the interaction and really make it easy to navigate versus having a static document that is our regulatory framework to really having something that is a very interactive format. To get the process started, we did ask everyone for some additional input on downtown. I know that we've had a number of surveys. We've been going through those historical surveys as well, but we were able to kind of see where there was some consensus in terms of what people like in downtown and what they would like to see more. I don't think it would come as any surprise that people constantly reference the small town feel, historic character, lively, warming, welcoming, quaint, a variety of restaurants and shops, the things that they'd like to see more in downtown. I think if I could, everyone turn their mic on all at once, which I am not encouraging, they would say we need more parking. So that came across very clearly in the survey results as well. But we also heard some new amenities, small scale grocery store, other types of missing retail. And there was an interest from some participants about more varied types of housing. Concerns about downtown, it was, there were quite a few that were identified, but many of them were kind of in common. There was talk about traffic, the wanting to be a more walkable place and too much traffic driving that, sort of this mix of modern and historic in terms of wayfinding signs or others. Obviously, some of the changes, people have identified that they feel like that's overdevelopment or large buildings, and questions about that context. And I think referencing back to how we're defining community character. The top three things that make downtown unique, overwhelmingly the vibrant Main Street, historic districts and buildings, and the outdoor community events were something that came across pretty clearly as those top three things that people had identified as part of the survey. We did ask the question towards the end of the survey if anyone sees challenges in this transition to a new unified land use code. And I think it was comforting in some ways to hear that many of you know that this is going to be a balancing act, that we're going to have to find a way to find that middle point for a lot of viewpoints of residents, businesses, people that you know, are new to the community, people that have lived here most of their adult lives. And I think overarchingly, that idea of maintaining downtown character while still allowing redevelopment and infill is something that was super top of mind for folks. I think most of you that have participated in the past, and for anyone that may be new, what we've tried to do is make our project website, envisionlittleton.org, a very up-to-date source. I'm showing you a screenshot of what we're going to be migrating to make it a little bit easier to find documents on the site. So we're in the process now of taking the pieces that currently exist on envisionlittleton.org and getting them into this new structure and new project website. So we hope to launch that within the next couple of weeks, but you don't have to remember anything because you already know that everything that you want to know about Envision Littleton is at envisionlittleton.org, and it will continue to be the one source of information. So never hesitate to go there because your questions most likely will get answered.
Okay, this is Brett Keith again. So in terms of the polling, it looks like that basically about a little over half of you have attended previous events for Envision Littleton, either through the visioning process, the comprehensive plan, or earlier in this code process. Again, most of you are residents of Littleton. Others may be visitors. And I'm also noticing that we have about a quarter of the attendees this evening that have not provided an answer. So if you could please try to answer the questions so we can get the most input we can possibly get, that would be terrific. We would appreciate that a lot. Also, we have, looks like most people are 40 years plus. So again, there's probably a good number of folks that have been in the community for quite some time. So this is helpful for us just to understand a little bit more about who we're talking to as some baseline information. So you can turn that off now, Brian. The Envision Studio, as Kathleen was talking about, was crafted specifically for Littleton. We fully recognize that residents are invested in their community and would like to see it develop in a certain way. And so we are coming to you. What's important for you to know is that Word 1 has not yet been written of this Unified Land Use Code, that we are providing this opportunity to come to residents to help educate us and inform us about what you like, in this case, about downtown, or what you would like to see as downtown matures into whatever it may be in the future, and to give you a direct hand and a voice in helping us to craft these regulations. As we've talked about, by using the polling questions, we're hoping that we can build some consensus around some key points or some key principles from what we learned tonight that will kind of elevate our confidence as we're drafting, that what we're drafting is what we're hearing from the community. Obviously, what we draft won't be the final point. We'll be revisiting that and talking through it again as a community as we are continuing to draft on downtown and then moving through each of the other points. Tonight, we're going to be showing you some just different alternatives or ideas. And what we're hoping to do is to either validate or invalidate some of these as being potentials for parts of downtown. We are attacking the downtown area as our first building block. So you can see that is highlighted in the darker blue area. So we'll be working on that through early to mid-summer. And then we will be pivoting our attention to the corridor and mixed use areas, which are shown in lavender or purple. You can see these areas essentially line the corridor. We'll be looking at the types of uses are there, how they function as development, whether there's opportunities for infill or redevelopment, and what y'all envision these looking like, how they present to the community. Beyond that, we'll be focusing in on the neighborhood areas and then ultimately in on the employment centers shown in red. We're working through this process very methodically. We've had all the work for the last 2.5 years building up to this moment. You've probably heard people say the devil's in the details. We're now putting together the details. So this is an opportunity to evolve to the point of actually putting specific regulations in place that will help bring to life what each of you or many of you have commented on through this point in the process. We're focusing on the building block. Again, we're hoping to identify kind of some key findings and points of consensus that come out of tonight. We will be reporting those and putting those on the website after this webinar this evening. So you'll be able to tune into the website and see what we learned and how people voted. We'll then go to work in terms of drafting over the next couple months, and then in mid-May, we'll be showing kind of a preliminary draft of where we're going with things. Again, we have no preconceived notions. Tonight is a big part of helping us to figure out what y'all want to see for downtown, and then we'll make any revisions and edits, and we'll come back in June. So we've got the next 3.5 months focused on downtown before we transition into the mixed use and corridor areas. And then obviously, as we work through the process, we'll be going through Planning Commission and City Council. What you're going to be doing tonight, I'm going to be covering a little bit of the background, basically what we've learned about downtown, kind of understanding what has created the character that you see on the ground today, and then what we know about the current regulations that have brought us to this point of what's permitted and what some of those standards are and how they have allowed what you see on the ground today or being built. And then also what we seek to know is your input to help educate and inform us. So we just want to kind of set some ground rules. We're going to be working shoulder to shoulder with each of you over the next 2 years. So we're really looking forward to building a good working relationship with you and personal relationships in many cases. So we know that there's a lot of different thoughts and opinions, and that's good. That's healthy for this process, and we want to hear all of those and respect all of those. As we've gone through this process over the last 2 years, what we've come to realize is that there are a lot more common interests than there are differences. Many of you share a lot of the same ideas and your passion for the community and what you want to see of the future. And that really made itself known through the comprehensive planning process and how that process turned out. So once again, if we can kind of keep the community as a whole in our focus of doing what's best for all of us as members of the community. And lastly, just to please participate in the polls, because this is our method of input. So we hear from you and we understand and educate ourselves through this process. So you'll be looking at a series of PowerPoint slides. We'll be showing you different images and asking for you to weigh in on your preferences. Should note that we are recording this session, so we'll be able to post this in full later, along with written reports that show the outcomes of what we learned tonight. And so we're asking for each of you to listen and learn. And at the same time, we're going to be listening and learning from what we hear from you through these poll questions. And again, we're hoping to get some synergies around some of these certain points so that we can start drafting regulations based upon what you want as residents and business owners and other folks that are invested in this community. We have assembled a 3D computer model, and this shows the 3 areas of downtown that we're going to be focusing in on tonight. We feel like these 3 areas are pretty descriptive of the types of development that we see throughout downtown. So what we will be doing is being able to use some of the models that we have created and we'll be showing you shortly. And we can place those models within this computer model and then show you within the context of neighborhoods and the properties that are adjacent to them, how some of these developments work, how they transition to neighboring developments, and how we deal with compatibility between different districts and different properties that are in close proximity or abutting one another. The next slide kind of zooms in on these areas a little bit more to show you a little bit more detail. These buildings are all accurate in terms of their height and in terms of the floor area or the amount of the lot that each of these buildings take up. And again, we'll be able to place new models within this during this exercise. And once the regulations are adopted, the city will be able to continue to use this to get building models from development applicants so that they can look at them in the context of the model that you're seeing here and be able to move around and look at from different perspectives. So it'll be very helpful in visualizing what's proposed. So one of the things that we did was just simply to black out all of the buildings. And I think this is very helpful for us to start understanding the character. As we talk about character, we think of it in terms of measurements of dimensions and of buildings and heights and distances between buildings. But this also shows scale. So you can see in some cases there are primary buildings on a lot with attached garages in the form of residential. Some of them have detached garages where you see more than one building or black square on a box. And then you see some of the buildings that are very large in scale comparative to what's around those. Those are the types of things that you experience as you live in these areas, or you drive through these areas. And a lot of these are what we've heard from community about, there being interests about what happens in the future with some of the development or redevelopment sites, so that we can be more deliberate in how downtown area develops and how properties work with one another or are compatible with each other. So you can look at the building size, you can look at the relationships between them side to side or across the street, and then you can simply see the scale of some of the buildings that have been more recently built. In addition, we've looked at how much of a lot is consumed by the building. So as you would expect, you can see some of the large buildings that are, greater than 50% of the lot. This relates to the bulk or the amount of building on a lot. And as you can imagine, as you drive through, that has a very definite impact on your perspective or your impression of these different areas. The more residential areas are very limited in terms of the building coverage. And as you get into different use types and more intense buildings, you can see how that building cover increases. This is not only important to the character, but it's also important to things like, together with the next slide on impervious cover, on the amount of snow removal, on the amount of heat island effect from parking areas, and the amount of stormwater runoff. So going hand in hand with that previous slide on building cover, this is looking at the building cover together with parking surfaces. So areas that are not pervious, that are not green. So once again, I think you can start to see how each of these start to paint a picture about the experience of this place and the types of buildings and the feeling that you get from looking at these different lots or driving up and down these streets. So this is some of our background analysis, just so we start to understand the relationships and start to put together a picture from our own perspective of what the character of downtown is. The zoning, many of you may be familiar with that. There's several different districts that are represented by the different colors on this map. Some of them are more commercial in use. Others of them are more residential. The orange are more multifamily or higher density, whereas the yellow is low density, single family, maybe two family. Then all the areas that are red or pink are different variations of commercial or mixed use type of development. The purple areas are more intensive industrially zoned properties. We took a look at the zoning that's represented by this table here. And what we learn is that there's a lot of commonality among these districts. A lot of the same uses are permitted in all these different districts, even though the intent or the purpose of the districts is different. In addition, there's not a lot of standards that help to create characters. I was talking about the measurements. You can see, for instance, that there is no minimum lot areas on many of the districts. In a lot of cases, there's no building heights. There's also no setbacks. So a lot of the things that we rely on through zoning to create deliberate outcomes or the certain character of downtown are not currently in the ordinance. There's a floor area ratio that's in there that's basically a ratio of the building square footage to the lot square footage. While that gives some flexibility, it also allows for a lot of differentiation because there's really nothing that says where that building needs to be placed on the lot. Or with no heights, you can have variations in heights. And so therefore you get the type of, pretty dramatic changes from place to place, from lot to lot throughout downtown. And that's what we're really looking at altering and getting your input as to what would you like to see in the future with building heights, building scale, where they sit on a lot, and how they interact with one another. And this just simply shows the uses of these properties with yellow again and orange being residential, the light green being mixed use, and then red being commercial. And you see a lot of blue, which are public and institutional types of uses. We can regulate by use, but without the other types of standards that you would find in a zoning ordinance. Use is not descriptive enough to realize the outcomes that we believe the community wants. So it'll be a combination of use and a lot of the things that Nore will be talking about here shortly in terms of different forms of buildings, different types of buildings, and their design. And this is just kind of a quick analysis that a lot of times what you find with zoning ordinances, sometimes they might have been written after development occurred, or they were written for the total but not for individual parcels. And therefore you get pieces that are non-conforming, meaning that these properties do not conform with the regulations. So the ones in dark blue are those where that land use is not permitted within that zoning district. You can see there's several of them scattered throughout downtown. And then the lighter blue are where the lot size does not meet the minimum lot size that's in the zoning ordinance. So that throws up roadblocks for any reinvestment because there's a process that somebody'd have to go through to basically get rid of the nonconformity before they can proceed. This is an opportunity to resolve those so that people are able to move forward more readily when they are prepared to improve their property or to develop, redevelop, or reuse a property. At this point, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Nore, and Nore is going to guide you through some introductory information of familiarizing you with some of the terms that he'll be using. And then there will be a series of slides where we're going to be asking you to vote on different alternatives. Nore?
Yes, sir. Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're crystal clear.
Okay, great. This is an exciting time, as everyone has said earlier on, and we're all learning. So I beg your indulgence in our shifting the format of this workshop to being online. And those who are listening and watching may not realize that we're all working in 3 different states in the US right now, the people that are presenting. So this is pretty exciting to watch. Brett introduced some of the issues related to design and how land use and design interact, and the degree to which buildings may be considered appropriate or compatible can be varied by a wide range of design variables. And what I want to do is sort of to help set a common vocabulary here in a few slides. First, introduce some terms that will show up as we get into the more detailed activities that we plan. You're going to be seeing lots of images. We'll try to go at a pace that's manageable here. And it is focusing on how you might be able to relate to community character. And so therefore, we are going to go back to those sub areas that Brett introduced. There will be 4 activities after I go through this initial vocabulary introduction. And for each of those, there will be another polling opportunity. So keep those polling fingers hot and ready. Images that you're going to see along the way are a combination of the good, bad, and the ugly. They are not necessarily proposals, and in fact, they are definitely not proposals. What we're trying to do is learn from you in terms of how you respond to the built environment and what you think would be appropriate. So you will see many images that you might disagree with. We've drawn a lot from the region and from communities that we work in across the country. So they do represent other development places and other opportunities that people have pursued in terms of infill and redevelopment. We've not really focused on the areas for preservation, although some of the scenarios you see, we have assumed preservation of some buildings, but we mostly are looking at what happens when infill occurs. So some of the terms we want to deal with are mass and scale, facade articulation, the character of the street level of a building, the way materials and details are used, and touching lightly on parking, because As Kathleen mentioned earlier, we learned from those earlier surveys that those were important. So if Brian will move on to the next slide, please. This is just an enlargement of the one that you've been seeing. And one of the articulation methods that we often see is a combination of one or more of these. One is offsets in a wall plane, where in a building, a series of different depth changes with respect to the building setback occurs. And in other cases, there may be articulation done by projection of materials or surface treatments. And in other cases, there's what we would call a step back. Now, that's different from a setback, where the building is positioned with respect to the lot line, but it's the stepping back of upper floors. And then in some cases, variations of material to help break up the mass of a building and make it appear to be a series of smaller buildings. And then generally, often you will see the use of compositional technique of a base, a middle, and a cap to sort of close the top of a building. Now let's look at some of those in more detail. I'll go through some of these rather quickly. This is an example of a building that to some degree is varying massing in height. Even though it is all a 3-story building, some portions are taller than others. There are variations to some extent in wall planes to provide a sense of articulation along the way. In addition to the varied massing, though, what's also going on here is the fact that there are entrances that are connecting directly to the street, and that there's some sense of a landscape foreground. We can compare that with the next image that shows a different technique for variation in massing. And in this case, it's a series of row houses that are expressed by the way in which basically a bay window projects out for each of the units. But again, it has individual entrances linking each of the building entrances. And parking in this case is accessed from an alley and tucked into the rear. In the next image, we'll look at that wall offset plane technique. So this is a single building that has a variation in the wall plane. And in this case, it's in the foreground, creating a plaza for outdoor dining and for public art and other amenities. Now, in the next image, though, you can see when this idea of articulation is maybe misunderstood. This is a project where the design has some variation in wall offsets, but the way in which the material is used kind of defeats that objective, because it's used uniformly across in a sort of layer cake effect. The articulation methods don't work. And some buildings that we see in the region, unfortunately, are doing this. They're not quite understanding articulation techniques. Moving to the next slide, we see perhaps a little bit better example of the way in which materials used somewhat consistently to express those different modules. And in this case, the roof form itself is also helping to provide that sense of rhythm that helps to break up the massing of the building along the way. And then next image, this is an example of that step back technique. This is a 3-story building, but not all of it is 3-story, and that's an important distinction. And here you will see an articulation of different building modules that reflect the historic tradition of this Main Street context. And that upper floor is designed to be very subordinate visually and be set back. In contrast with that one, in the next image, you can see the same techniques being applied, but even at a larger scale. This building actually has 2 residential layers above a retail layer and an office layer. But it's set back substantially to the extent that the perception at the street level is primarily a 2-story building with an accent corner of 3 floors. And then a different expression of that is in the next slide, where you see also a variation in height, but in this case, it is visible from the street level, a single building with a combination of heights. Now, some of these may be more massive than you would find appropriate for Littleton, and that's not what I'm trying to suggest here. What I want to do is introduce these terms in terms of, and think about these just as forms and how those might be applicable to help buildings fit in better to any of those individual sub areas that Brett was describing earlier. Let's look at the next slide, where it's another one of the no-no examples that I often use, unfortunately. And this is one where the design relies totally on the change in color to create that illusion of varied massing. And I think most of us would agree it doesn't work. And so it means that if you approach varied massing articulation, you need to do so in a way that is consistent, which is what you see here in this image, where materials are used consistently for an individual module. You see a sense of a base in the middle of and a cap that brings a sense of closure to the building as it rises up, and the accent is at the corner. While I've been talking about massing, the next image really introduces the fact that materials can be used to help break up massing as well. And these are just a few examples, some more traditional ones. The upper image of using a base of stone and an upper level of brick is something that many of our communities saw traditionally. There are various interpretations of that in different ways that are expressed in Littleton. And then an example of a more contemporary interpretation, but again, using materials in a consistent way so that the building modules are expressed. That shows up a little bit more in the next image, which is one that is making use of synthetic siding to express different modules along the building. But also you can see the definition of a base in the middle and a cap being used as a technique. Now, to quickly shift over to thinking about the street level character. And for much of the core commercial area, the tradition is a display window that provides visual interest. People see goods and services and activities going on inside. It encourages walking, encourages the pedestrian environment. But in some cases, that's not always practical, and there are other ways of skinning that cat, if you will. The next image shows an example of using landscaping on the interior of the sidewalk edge where the building walls are set back. So here you see a combination of the use of that varied wall plane and setback of wall planes, but also introducing landscaping as a tool for creating pedestrian interest. There are other techniques, certainly in multifamily projects, which you see in the next image, of using stoops and porches to create a sense of interest along the way. What's important here is that there be enough space for that outdoor place to actually be meaningful and to actually invite people to make use of them so they help energize the street. These can sometimes be summarized in pages like this in design standards. Brad alluded to the fact that the design standards for downtown Littleton right now, while they're very good, don't go into a certain level of detail that might be appropriate. And this is one example of showing alternatives for how you could create street level interest when an actual storefront might not be the option because of the functional requirements of the building. So as we move through the project, we'll be thinking about those kinds of options. And lastly, I just want to show 2 slides of a single building that I think demonstrates that these concepts of physical building form compatibility can be applied to a variety of uses. And this is a very interesting building. Some of you may know this. This is in Boulder. This is a 400-car parking structure. You get a glimpse of the upper levels at the top of it, but it has a wrap of retail and office uses that energize the street. And the next image just shows the overall building a little bit more from the air, just so you can see how it actually works. It's occupying an entire block, and Brian, can you move to the next one? There we go. So that's the overall building, and it's an interesting example of how considering context and defining design principles both through zoning standards and design guidelines and standards, you can think about how other uses can be introduced in a compatible way. So that's the first segment I wanted to introduce here, just in terms of establishing a little bit of a common vocabulary. I want to shift
Sorry,
now to the three sub areas that were introduced earlier. And
Hey, Nori,
yes,
if I can interject real quick for the folks who are participating, the polling is only offered at certain junctures in the presentation. So you may see a blank space or the polling may go away until we get to those points in the presentation. So after activity one, Nori will be introducing the polling questions. And that's at the time that you will be able to provide your response.
right. So we selected those three sub areas that are defined in the current design standards because they do represent some distinctly different contexts, but also I think information we get from your thoughts about them we can apply to the other areas as well. And I will say that because of the format, be patient. The questions are very simple, and you may be frustrated in some cases in that you aren't able to give gradations of answers. At this stage of the game, simple answers are what we can handle. Based on this, we're going to learn more. We're going to refine some of these questions and repost some of them later on online. So you're helping us refine the tool as we move through it here. So let's look first then at sub-area 2. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides for sub-area 2. This is, of course, the area that's just sort of north and east of downtown. And you can see that it includes portions of Hill Street, and Powers is sort of a key east-west street. These are some random photographs just to help jog your memory of what the area looks like today. Now, moving to the next slide is a vision statement for that area. The current design standards have a description of the future character for the area. And we've taken that and tried to craft it into a vision statement, and then with some more specific descriptors for the area. And then we're going to be asking you whether you think this statement is appropriate or inappropriate. And again, if there are minor tweaks, bear with us. I would recommend vote appropriate. If it's just totally wrong, then we'll ask you to vote no. And there will be an opportunity to quickly make some suggestions about how you might modify it. So for the Northeast neighborhood, sub-area 2, it is a pedestrian-oriented place and reflects its residential heritage and the character of the street edge and in building forms, while transitioning to a moderately higher density with some commercial uses mixed in with residential. Some keywords here are that this area is a mix of use and mix of building types, but that it does maintain that residential street edge in different forms with setbacks of buildings and even landscaping. The scale of buildings is predominantly 2 stories, but with some 3, but also 1-story elements to help bring it down to that traditional scale. Use of sloping roof forms, porches, consistent setbacks, and parking being subordinate are key parts of that. So at this point, we'd like to invite you to comment on the appropriateness of this particular vision statement. We'll give you 2 minutes.
There are about 30 seconds remaining. And we will be closing the survey and showing the results here momentarily.
Well, good. It looks like at least we are potentially off to a good start here. We will want to, we're not seeing, of course, anyone's written suggestions. We will be reviewing those and responding to them. And we also will find a way to summarize those in a workshop report that will be posted. Let's move on to the next one. Now, this is the Northwest residential area and sort of focused around Nevada. And Powers is one of the representative east-west streets. There are a couple of images here on this page, and because of the scale of these photos, we also have a second slide of just images for sub-area 4 as well, to refresh your memory about the Northwest residential sub-area. So if you want to move to that next slide, Brian, thank you. Now moving to the vision statement. Some of the wording will appear similar to what you just saw, but what's going to be different here is there's no mention of mixed use and commercial because this is a residential district. But the Northwest residential area is also pedestrian oriented and reflects its heritage in the character of the street edge and building forms, while transitioning to a moderately higher density of residential uses. Buildings have a sense of connection to the street and to the neighborhood. Scale is predominantly 2 and 3 stories, but again with 1-story elements in front to reduce scale. They have rectilinear forms with sloping roofs are predominant, particularly in the front of the buildings. Porches and entrances face the street to connect to the neighborhood. Frontages are consistent in that there is a landscaped front yard and parking is again in the rear and screened. So again, we would ask your opinion of whether or not this in general captures the vision for the Northwest residential area. So Brian?
Brian will be turning on the poll here momentarily. If there are any of those of you who are not able to see the poll, in the far upper right corner of your screen, you may find a circle, and if you hover over that circle, it'll give you 2 or 3 options, including a side-by-side view or a floating panel view. So you might try to click on that circle. It'll enlarge to kind of an elongated circle, and then you might try one of the other 2 alternatives to see if the poll shows up for you. So if you have the full screen view, I note that the poll overlaps the screen. And if you have the side-by-side view, the slide is to the left side of the poll, which is the right side of your screen. It could be that you may need to scroll over if you have a small screen. There are about 30 seconds remaining. The poll has ended. The results will show momentarily.
Okay, somewhat of a similar balance, but a little drop in support for that vision statement. So we'll really want to look at some of the text suggestions to get a better understanding of how that might need to be adjusted. Let's move on. The last one, sub-area 6. Now, this is Alamo Avenue. Now, the existing design standards recognize that even within this sub-area, there are shades of differences between the western side and the eastern end. And we'll be talking more about the eastern end for this particular activity, but the images give you a sense of the overall context. And moving to the next slide, we have the vision statement. So the Alamo Avenue sub-area, particularly the eastern portion, complements Main Street with an active pedestrian-oriented street edge and urban building forms. Mixed-use buildings are predominant. In scale, they're predominantly 2 and 3 stories, but some 4 stories. Primarily rectilinear forms with varied massing. Storefronts and lobby entrances are at the street level to activate it. There's a uniform alignment at the sidewalk edge, and parking again is subordinate, or in this particular context, it might even be potentially underground. So again, let's open the polling for this one.
There are 30 seconds remaining. The poll is closed, and the results will show momentarily. I will also remind everybody that we are 1 hour into this 2-hour scheduled webinar.
So it's interesting. I think while, you know, about half are saying, yes, these are correct, there are many others who have concerns about them. And I think we'll be able to learn a little bit more about that, both in seeing some of the written responses, but also as we move into some of the next activities, because we're also going to continue to look at these 3 sub areas, but now get a little bit more visual in terms of what might be going on in them and potential development. What I want to do next is introduce a series of building types that may be permitted in downtown Littleton. Now, these images are not necessarily specific proposals, again, for buildings for Littleton. They illustrate the range of building types, and I want to so again set these forth as a kind of a vocabulary, because then we're going to take some of these different building types and mix and match them into some alternative development scenarios for those three sub areas. So we'll first begin with some mixed use buildings, and we have organized those into three different scales. Excuse me. So we're starting with the biggest first. These are what we're calling large mixed-use buildings. They have storefronts at the street level. They are articulated into modules. The parking is screened or is underground. They may have variation in height also by step backs, but they're generally rather large. And in the case of Littleton, that would mean 4 stories potentially. On the next level, dropping down a little bit, is a medium-scale mixed-use building prototype, similar kind of form, similar kinds of uses, but 3 stories or even a mix of 3 and 2 stories. So stepping down in scale moderately would be what we're calling a mixed use, medium-sized mixed-use building. The next one is even smaller, dropping down to 2, at least in the front, with a 3rd floor stepped back, generally speaking, or at some step back level. Here's the model is stepping back at the 1st floor. The photograph shows you again that building that steps back at the 2nd floor. So those are the 3 mixed use building types that we're going to play with. Next is the apartment building type. That's generally a larger residential structure that has one or at least a few central entrances that are shared by units, and there's a central lobby, even elevators, depending on the height of the building. And these are generally large enough to have parking that is structured or is screened behind. Dropping down in scale is the townhouse. And we've also illustrated them in 2 categories of large and small. The larger townhouse generally being 3 floors, but they do have stoops or porches that define entrances, and there's some articulation that expresses the different units along a row of buildings. The medium scale one drops down a little bit in height. It's 2 stories, or at most 2.5, with a 3rd floor tucked into a roof form. So they are a little bit smaller. Then our last building block that we're going to work with is what we're calling a multiplex, and that is a building that is designed to reflect traditional house forms, but it is larger. It generally has 4 and maybe up to 6 residential units within that building form. And then lastly is a duplex. And so this is one where it's 2 units that are attached, and they may have roof forms that are expressing those different units, but they have individual entries defined. Now, there are variations, of course, on all of those forms, and you're all probably familiar with those. So let's now take those, and we're going to start mixing and matching some of those building forms in those 3 different sub-areas. And so we're going to start with sub-area 2 again, the northeast. And this one, remember, accommodates a mix of uses, but also expresses some traditional front setbacks. So in this low density scenario, you will see a combination of buildings that are 2 and 3 stories, but the 3-story buildings have some portions that are stepped back to maintain a lower scale at the street edge, either 1 or 2 stories. What you're looking at is a single site with 2 different views. And we have just assumed certain redevelopment and infill development and a combination of other existing buildings being retained in this particular scenario. The tan buildings are those that are new, and the white buildings are those that are existing. So this is our low density scenario for sub-area 2. Moving to the Next slide. Density increases a bit. A bit more of the block is redeveloped, and the scale of the buildings increases also up to 3 floors, and the lot coverage increases a bit. You can see the corner plaza has gotten smaller in this case. And it still does make use of some of those step back techniques to maintain a sense of a lower street level along the sidewalk edge. So these are 2 alternative scenarios that we're now going to ask you to respond to. So we've repeated one image for each of those here, and to allow you to now open the poll and comment as to whether or not you think each of those scenarios is appropriate for this context or not.
If you choose not to vote, that will tell us that you are not in favor of either one of these options. So again, if you don't prefer either one of these in this particular sub area, simply do not vote, and that will tell us that neither of these are considered appropriate by those of you participating. There are 30 seconds remaining. The poll is now closed, and we will show the results. We'd also like to make sure that it is understood that all the buildings that we're showing here are permitted by the current zoning. So different types of building forms and scales and heights and so forth, those are permitted by the current zoning, albeit whether you consider them to be appropriate in these different contexts. That's the reason for our polling this evening, so we can learn that from you.
So again, I'm seeing, at least initially, we'll want to go back in and look at this material later on in more detail, but tentative support, but marginal. And clearly there are going to be some questions about the scale and intensity of development here. Let's move on to the next one for sub-area 4. Now for this one, we're going to show 3 different scenarios. This is the low intensity scenario. And again, you're looking at the same block from 2 different views. This, of course, has an alley down the middle, so you see some garage structures along the alley. And in the upper view, view 1, there are some townhouses attached basically as duplexes with some relatively low lot coverage. So there's some substantial side yard in between the row houses. In view 2, you see some duplexes and one of those fourplexes at the right-hand side, one of those larger buildings, but designed to reflect some of the traditional residential building forms. Moving on to the medium density, the scale increases in height in some cases, but also an intensity of lot coverage. So we see in the view 1 now a series of row houses that are connected. There's less of a break between them. And in view 2, again, you see that same fourplex at the right-hand edge, but an increase in the number of the duplexes on the corner. Then moving to 5, the higher density, here we have a continuous row of 3-story townhouses in view 1. And you see the backside of them with tuck-under parking in view 2. And then in view 2 on the street frontage now, an increase in height and density of the residential structures there. So a gradation of increase in some lot coverage and in building height is illustrated in these 3 different scenarios. So we'll open the polling for this one.
There are 30 seconds remaining. The poll is now closed. If you would like to turn off your video, if you use your mouse and you scroll to the bottom of your screen, you should see a series of 7 circles appear. The second one from the left is a video camera, and you should be able to click on that and it will turn off your video and put a slash through that circle, and it will probably turn red. So if you'd like to do that, just again, take your mouse and scroll to the bottom middle of your screen. Those will appear. You can click on the video and turn it off.
Well, this is now beginning to give us, I think, some really interesting information, because you can definitely see a change in response amongst the 3 different scenarios. So this will be something we'll really want to analyze. Let's move on to the last one. So this is sub-area 6, again, along Alamo. And again, these are all buildings that can be built under the existing code. And we are going to have 3 different scenarios for sub-area 6. Again, the white buildings are existing ones. and the tan ones are new ones. So this is the low density scenario. The tallest building here is 3 stories, even though 4 stories is possible under the height limit. But a portion of it, and in view 1, you see it anchors the corner with a 3-story element. But then the 3rd floor for a portion of the building is stepped back so that a 2-story edge is maintained along the street. And actually a portion of it in the upper right image of view 1 is actually only 2 stories. And there's some articulation and variation in the building modules, if you will. In view 2, you see the other corner is anchored by a 2-story building. But it also has a step back so that a portion of it is reflecting a 1-story scale at the street edge. For these, the parking would presumably be structured either tucked under in the ground level or even below grade or some combination of that. The medium density increases a little bit more. It includes a 4-story building at the corner, but again, with the upper floor being stepped back some and the back end of the building in view 1, the rightmost edge of it, going down to only 3 stories. In view 2, you see that the corner building now has added a floor as well. And there's a moderate increase in the height in the buildings in the middle of the block as also. And then moving to the high density scenario, there's more of a 4-story development, but with portions stepped back at a 3rd floor level, and the corner building in view 2 now is at 3 stories again. So a continuing increase in intensity, if you will. And so now we'll open the voting for this one.
Just as a
Remember,
reminder,
this is along Alamo.
there you go. Thirty seconds remaining. Poll is now closed. I should note that you are able to grab the left edge of the poll and drag it to the left to make it a little wider if it's truncated and you're not able to read the percentages.
Well, again, there's a real strong progression here of a sense of appropriateness for the lower density development patterns, and then a decreasing sense of appropriateness as the intensity increases. So this will be some very useful information for us to move forward in the next level of discussion and of other upcoming workshops. So we've been talking a lot about varied massing and how that might affect compatibility, but we've also mixed that up in those last scenarios with different intensity levels of development and different building types and uses. We wanted to just, excuse me, quickly ask about how effective you think this tool of varied massing is in improving compatibility or not. So I wanted to briefly go through those techniques we've been seeing. And we have a slide that represents each one of those individually. So we're just going to look quickly at about a half a dozen slides of articulation techniques. And then we will ask just one simple question about whether or not you think this is a useful tool in terms of thinking about codes and standards. So the first one is let's just start with a basic mass that really has very little articulation in it, and is at the maximum of 4 floors, which is potentially achievable under the downtown height limit. So that's starting out, and we're going to name these so that you can just think about them. So this is MUA, if you will. Moving on to the next one is that idea of stepping back some upper floors. So in this case, there's an upper floor step back, a modest one at a first floor to maintain a 1-story street level scale. Or in the next one, it can move up to include an anchoring element at the corner that we are calling an iconic corner, is often used as a treatment element. You can also see the use of balconies to help express or differentiate some building modules from others. In this case, the width of those modules is reflecting the historic development lot width. This one is one that the step back goes up to the 3rd floor. So it's a taller street level edge, but it is stepping that height back. And those variations in setbacks can be increased substantially. We're showing fairly modest ones here, but sometimes in some of the examples you saw, they're much more substantial. And then moving on to the next one is actually stepping down some floor level. So this is combining that concept of step back, but also actually reducing some of the overall building height and number of floors. So in this kind of a scenario, what's happening is that while the maximum building height might be 4 floors, it may be that not all of the building footprint can be built to 4 floors. And then, while those deal with vertical height, the other is to break up wall length. And the offsets that we've looked at earlier are some techniques for doing that, but in some cases, really more substantially breaking up the wall length of a larger building is needed or is a useful tool. And that's done by creating a courtyard or a plaza in this scenario, where it really creates a large notch so that it reads to the pedestrian as though you're walking by 2 different buildings. And then lastly, that can actually be represented in some situations where the building is actually broken into 2 separate buildings and there is a pass-through, there is an open space. And that is the most substantial, I guess, if you will, of breaking up the massing. So those are some of the varied massing techniques that we've been showing in those scenarios. And so I just would like to ask the question of how effective you think considering these in standards for downtown would be. So let's open that. It's a single question, but you do have the opportunity in this case to be a little bit more shaded in the way in which you respond.
We will shorten this time limit to 1 minute since it's just one question. Thirty seconds remaining. Poll is closed.
Okay, well, I think we've got some good information here, and that's going to be helpful to us as we move into the next series of workshops and can come back with some more refined approaches to some of these techniques. Let's now, while we've been dealing with models from computers that are very simplified, and we're talking about form and massing, let's now look at some reality, and we're going to go quickly through a series of photographs of building types. We're going to ask you which you think would be appropriate in downtown in general. In this case, we're not placing them necessarily in one specific context, but you'll be seeing variations in scale and massing and articulation, but also changes in materials and the way buildings orient to the street. I think we've broken them into 4 or 5 categories that we'll pause each time to have you vote. The first are mixed-use buildings of large scale, again, but this time you're going to actually see some photographs of some real ones. So the next slide shows one, and they are, this is the series that we're going to see: mixed-use large, mixed-use medium, mixed-use small, and then apartment, townhouse, and that 4 to 6plex. And you're going to see some examples. You're going to get to tell us individually whether or not you think these would be appropriate in downtown. And we'll show them to you as individual images, and then we'll show them again grouped by category for you to vote on. So this is a single building that's articulated. It's divided into modules. It's 3 stories in height with some 4 stories that are stepped way back from the street edge. That's ML, mixed use large 1. ML2 rises to 4 stories and is residential on top with retail below, and has a change of materials to express the modules. And ML3 has an upper floor, 4th floor that is stepped back, but has a street level of retail, and then a mix of residential and offices in the middle floors. So those are the 3 buildings for mixed use large. So there are 3 and 4 story buildings, or 4-story buildings, but with some 3-story expression. And we'll open the polling as to whether or not you think those would be inappropriate or appropriate or inappropriate in downtown.
Once again, if you think all of them are inappropriate, just signify by not answering these questions.
Or you can vote no.
Yes, that's true. We will shorten this to 1.5 minutes since there are 3 simple questions. We have 30 seconds remaining. There are the results.
Okay, we're going to move through. We're not going to spend much time looking at these right now, but it is interesting seeing the distribution of responses here. Because in the interest of time, I want to move on to the medium scale. And again, you're going to see 3 different buildings. So this is a 2- and 3-story medium scale mixed use building with residential above and retail below. That's MM1. Medium scale mixed use number 2 has retail below and some wall offsets as well, and then a stepped back portion with a plaza in front. And then the MM3. You saw this one earlier. It's a mixed-use building with residential, 2 stories of residential above 1-story retail with a varied roof form. So again, we'll ask your voting about those buildings.
Thirty seconds remaining.
Great. Okay, we'll really look forward to analyzing these responses. Let's move quickly now to the low scale mixed use. And then upcoming after that will be some residential products. So these are predominantly 2 stories at the street edge with perhaps an upper floor setback, in this case for MS1. For mixed use small scale number 2, it is 2 stories only with some wall offsets, retail below, offices above. And mixed use small is a smaller footprint and retail below with some lofts above. So let's open the voting for these.
Thirty seconds remaining. Here are the results.
Okay, great. Now let's move on to the residential products. We'll start with the higher scale, the apartment. So this is a 4-story apartment building, some variation in massing and setbacks and articulation of wall planes, individual entrances facing the street with some foreground of landscaping. The second one introduces traditional roof forms and divides it into modules that are separated by some breezeways, which are also serving as the entry points for them. And the third one takes that a little step farther in expressing or articulating these into separate modules, even though it all is a interconnected single building with again a central entrance, but some landscaping and outdoor use areas to activate the street edge. So let's open the poll for this one.
Thirty seconds remain. The results.
Okay, some very different opinions here. This will be very, very interesting to look at. Boy, this is going to be wonderful information. All right, let's move to townhouses. So these are attached single-family units with individual entrances. This one has garages that are accessing onto the street. The second one introduces more traditional roof forms and porches that connect to the street. But again, these are all party wall buildings. And then one that makes use of brick. And these are at 3 stories, but again, with individual entrances. So let's open the polling for those.
Thirty seconds remaining. Results, and we have one final poll coming.
Yep, moving on to that one. Well, these are attached units and express them individually. Another building form is the 4 to 6-plex, which is sometimes called a mansion or estate building as well. And what these do really is try to emulate more just a large house form, but they contain several units, 4 to 6 units. So this is one that is using traditional house forms, breaking up the massing a little bit, but it's basically one large volume with one primary entrance. That's P2. P1. P2 is somewhat similar in that it has a central entry area, but several of the entrances are individual within that larger residential building form. And then the third one is a bit smaller, but it has a shared entrances off of a porch facing the street. And in this case, you can see that the garages are located along the alley. And the units are actually upstairs and facing into a courtyard that's on the left. So let's get your opinions on the idea of the 4 to 6-plex building type.
Thirty seconds remaining. The results.
Well, this is really great. From my perspective, I'm really excited about the information that was collected this evening, because as we have time to go back now and compare the results, the shading, the gradation of responses is going to be really informative. It's going to help us think about the scale of building, the design characteristics that might be expressed in various standards and guidelines. But particularly will help us in framing some finer grained material for another upcoming workshop webinar, depending on circumstances. And Brett and Kathleen will be able to talk about that more. I'll turn it back over to them for some other general observations here.
Thanks, Nori. Just would like to, again, thank everyone. I know that Brett said at the very beginning, we haven't started drafting, and it's really helpful at this point. You might be wondering, well, how is what we did tonight even going to be helpful? But it is so immensely helpful, and I want to express our combined thanks for the information that you provided tonight. And then what we hope to do is summarize the meeting, make this recording available. So for anyone that was unable to connect tonight that may have RSVP'd, or anyone that wants to just check it out beyond those that were able to make the time tonight, we'll have the chance to go through all of your comments and polling results and be able to summarize those as well. And also take a look at the downtown survey and kind of combine those things together. As Nori mentioned, we are currently scheduled for a second Envision Studio in mid-May. There are a lot of uncertainties, so we'll keep you very informed as to what format we're able to pursue for May, and really take this experience as much as the Unified Land Use Code is a process of discovery, I feel like we went into tonight's webinar with much the same approach, a process of discovery. So I think we've learned some things along the way. As you have feedback, you might remember that I have a super easy email address. It's kosher, spells kosher, @littletongov.org. I'd love your feedback as well. And then I want to just kind of remind you of the timing. We're going to be looking at putting this regulatory language together over the next few months, again with another studio in mid-May. So we hope to have something that we can start to have reactions to in that June, July timeframe. And then the last thing that I'd like to do is remind you how important the census is to the city of Littleton. And I feel like because it's online, maybe we're all getting much more comfortable with that, and you might have a few extra moments. So I would like to really encourage, particularly our residents here, to go ahead and log on to that 2020census.gov and put in that information. It is incredibly helpful for us to get a huge response rate I think what I've heard from my colleagues that are just working so hard to keep this top of mind for our residents is that our response rate is higher than others in the county, and we want to keep that being true. So please, if you haven't already, take that moment to go ahead and check out the census. I think that's all that we have tonight. Brett, I don't know if you want to chime in.
Yeah, just to express our sincere thanks for all of you that took 2 hours out of your evening to help us this evening. This process is citizen and stakeholder driven. So we are really looking to you to give us this direct feedback. We know that we have a higher confidence now than we did 2 hours ago in terms of drafting. We anticipate that there will be comments. We won't get everything right, and that's okay. There'll be another opportunity when we can again revisit and start to frame up some of what we understood to be your vision for downtown, and then we'll continue in an iterative manner thereafter until we settle on a draft that we think is something that we can all live with and support. So once again, thank you all very much, and we will be communicating with you as we get the website updated and get materials populated on that website so you can see what the results of tonight were. So thank you all very much. We look forward to seeing you all again soon, and please stay healthy. Thank you and good evening. You can all hit